yeah, it's another one of these ones where you can only see my screen rather than my face. Although, maybe that's not such a bad thing. So today, I'm going to show you how I like to elect marriage charts. It's one of the more common things I'm asked to elect times for. Basically, the idea is you pick an astrologically auspicious time to begin an important endeavor, and ideally it should result in a better outcome. Now, this raises some interesting questions about, to what degree then astrology is faded and all that, but I'm going to focus on more of the technical considerations of marriage elections. So for any election, you're going to want to consider the ruler of the ascendant. The ruler of the ascendant shows you the basic nature and strength of the enterprise as a whole. So I'm using traditional rulers, and I'm also using whole sign houses for this discussion. But basically, you want to make sure that the ruler of the ascendant is in good shape. So that means in its own sign, if possible. At least not in the sign of its fall. I don't think that a planet being in detriment or anti-domicile is actually that bad, but I do try to avoid signs being the sign of their fall. You also want to make sure that that planet is in decent shape heliacally, aka not retrograde, or at least as close to the direct station as possible. The idea being that the closer a planet is to resuming direct motion, the more normal or expected its significations will be. And then horizontally, we want to make sure that, that the planet is in good houses, so-called good houses, which are the houses which form a Ptolemaic or sign-based aspect to the ascendant. So if it's in a bad place, if it's in the 12th house or 6th house or 8th house or 2nd house, because it doesn't form an aspect to the ascendant. And I also try to avoid cadent houses, since cadent houses are typically weaker. So 3rd and 9th I try to avoid as well. Now for a marriage, the 7th house is associated with marriage, and so ideally we want the ruler of the 7th house to be in good shape as well. Just as much as we'd like the ascendant to be in good shape, we also want the ruler of the 7th house to be in good shape. And ideally, we would want the ruler of the ascendant and the 7th house to be applying towards each other. Either the ruler of the ascendant applying to the ruler of the 7th, or the ruler of the 7th applying to the ruler of the 1st. The idea is we're trying to unite two people in a wedding. So it seems to make sense that you'd want kind of these two planets to be, converging rather than separating, or at least in a very tight aspect. And another thing that can help in a marriage election is if the ruler of the ascendant is in the 7th house, which would automatically be its anti-domicile, or the ruler of the 7th in the 1st house. So if there's some sort of reception between these two rulers, and that's good as well, sort of shows that the focus of the enterprise is on the 7th house topics like weddings and partnerships. It's also nice if there are no bad planets, Mars or Saturn, in the 7th house, or and conversely, you want good planets in the 7th house. So if you can aim for that, that's, I think, ideal. The other thing that's really important in any election are favorable applications of the moon. Preferably, you'd want it to be forming an aspect to the ruler of the ascendant, the ruler of the 7th, or benefics. And hopefully they're the same thing, but sometimes they're not. So when the moon is applying to benefics, I typically don't discriminate on the basis of whether the aspect is a hard or soft aspect. I think if the moon is forming an aspect to a benefic, then that's better than having to form an aspect with a malefic. Another thing, which kind of goes back to some of the rules of Serapio, is that you want the moon increasing in light for elections where you are building something up, and you want it decreasing in light when you want to break something down. So in the case of a marriage, I mean, I think we definitely want a marriage to be as long-lasting as possible. So ideally, you'd want the moon increasing in light, as in, approaching the full moon or on its way to becoming a full moon. Malefics are always difficult to treat in electional charts. During the day, Mars is going to be the planet that you want to control more. In a day chart, Mars likes to be underneath the horizon, and you can also make Mars cadent, either in its joy in the 6th or in the 3rd, ideally, in a day chart. The same thing for Saturn at night. You want Saturn to you want Saturn to be tucked away at night. You don't want those planets to be ruling major houses in the chart. So, you can't always do everything you'd like to do in electional, but it's best to make the malefics as powerless as possible, because no one likes the malefics. Generally you want to elevate the benefics and minimize the malefics. And another funny thing that sometimes comes up is sometimes I'll find a perfect electional chart, but then I'll look at how it compares with the natal charts of the two people who are getting married, and it doesn't look that great. So I think, just to be on the safe side, I think make sure the chart actually works well with the two people getting married. What's kind of interesting to think about is the fact that there are actually only 4 possible 1st and 7th house ruler combinations. If Leo or Aquarius are rising, then the 1st and 7th rulers will be Sun, Saturn. If Capricorn or Cancer is rising for your wedding electional, then the rulers will be Moon and Saturn. If Gemini, Virgo, Sagittarius, or Pisces are rising, then Mercury and Jupiter will be the 1st and 7th house rulers. And then if you have Aries, Taurus, Libra, or Scorpio rising for an electional chart, then Venus and Mars will be your 1st and 7th house rulers. And I think this is sort of interesting because this gives us a picture then of kind of the 4 categories of relationships. I think the Sun, Saturn, and Moon, Saturn relationships kind of have to do with, submissive versus dominating, leader and follower. And then Mercury and Jupiter seems to be more in the domain of friends or shared philosophical interests, or just Mercury Jupiter seems to be more friendly. And then Venus Mars, of course, is wow chicka wow wow. Also interesting to note that Leo and Aquarius are probably better to have as wedding elections which happen during the daytime, since both the Sun and Saturn are of the diurnal sect. Whereas if the wedding is happening at night, then Venus and Mars may be better to have as the rulers, since they'll be of the sect. And remember, probably the number one rule of all electional charts is that there's just never going to be the perfect chart. It's a constant game of, bouncing, competing instincts. Because sometimes if you want to get a favorable application of the moon, it'll mean shifting something else out of place. It's like a Rubik's Cube, trying to find the right date. So anyway, I thought what I would do is I would show you guys some real-life examples of weddings that obviously weren't elected. These happen more or less naturally, and unfortunately all of my examples are from the royal family, but I mean, it's pretty reliable data. It's those are public events. There's no dispute about when they happened. Everyone's eyeballs are on them, so it's kind of cool because we actually have a timed a time for the wedding of Queen Victoria. So I mean, this data is like 200 years old. We actually have a decent time for it. So yeah, Queen Victoria, she was married on February 10th, 1840, 1 p.m. in London. And so first thing we got to do is kind of look at the ascendant. So Cancer is rising, so that means the moon is going to be ruling this inception, this marriage, in which Queen Victoria was absolutely nuts about Prince Albert. And so we see the moon is in Taurus, and the moon is exalted in Taurus. It's one of its best positions it can possibly be in. So that's a really good start. I mean, if I were electing this, I would probably aim for that as well. I think that's pretty cool. Then if we look over on the 7th house, on the descendant, we see that Venus is right there. So Venus, the planet of unions itself, is pivotal. It's setting right in the house of partnerships. So that's a good, that's pretty decent. I mean, that's kind of what we'd expect, and it's even what an astrologer might even try to go for. It sort of indicates harmony and, romance and love, and especially dutiful and honorable love, I guess. In Capricorn, it's very Saturnian kind of flavor. And then, but the ruler of the 7th house is Saturn, and Saturn's in Sagittarius in the 6th. That's probably not terribly great. Another thing that's kind of weird about that is, even though they're both at 19 degrees of their respective signs, they are technically, unable to see each other. Some people will call it an inconjunct or quincunx, but yeah, not really all about that. I would say they're not in a relationship. But this moon is really, really powerful in Taurus. And it's also, its previous aspect was in opposition to Jupiter. It's still fairly close to its opposition with Jupiter. So that kind of gives this moon a nice dose of Jupiterian depth and luck and optimism. The moon is directly applying to a square with the sun, and it's not like the best. It's not the best application. I mean, if I were electing this, I would probably, if I could have what I wanted, I'd probably want the moon either directly applying a trine to that Venus, or directly applying the opposition to Jupiter. So, I mean, this was done without an astrologer, and it's still a fairly decent chart. There's still some nice things about this chart just from the outset. The powerfully placed ruler of the ascendant, Venus, setting on the descendant. So, let's take a look at the next one. Queen Elizabeth II, her wedding. That was on November 20th, 1947 at 11:30 a.m. in London. And so what's interesting here is we have Capricorn rising, so that makes Saturn the ruler of the ascendant, and then we have Cancer setting, which is ruled by the moon. So this is a moon-Saturn relationship, and lo and behold, the moon is in an exact opposition with Saturn. So the ruler of the 1st and 7th have completed an opposition with each other very, very recently. It's actually 8 minutes past the opposition to Saturn. I don't know if the 11:30 time is exact, because it really would be just a matter of minutes as that moon has applied to Saturn. I would guess that perhaps the moon finished its application to Saturn as soon as they had formalized the, at the time that it was a really done deal. If the moon really was separating even just a little bit from Saturn, then it would technically be heading into a really nasty opposition with the contrary to sect malefic, Mars in the 8th. And I don't think that's really come to pass in their relationship. we do know a little bit. The Netflix show, The Crown, has actually dramatized the relationship between Philip and Elizabeth, and we know from this, as well as from other accounts I was reading, that their marriage was kind of difficult because her family didn't really want Philip to be in the family. He wasn't really considered a real prince, and there were a lot of people who didn't want it to happen. So this marriage happened despite what people around Elizabeth wanted. But I mean, she's the queen, so yeah, she got what she wanted. But he kind of struggled too. He resented her as much as he supported her as queen. So I think the fact that this is such a tense opposition, I don't know, maybe it speaks to that. Another really terrible thing about this election is the fact that, one of the other rules of elections, you're technically never supposed to put the moon at the bendings, or, square the nodes of the moon, or conjunct the nodes of the moon. And this moon is exactly square the bendings. And also, in opposition with Saturn. But since it rules the first, and since the moon rules the seventh, it seems to be kind of appropriate for this event. Let's go to the next big royal wedding. This was Princess Diana's. And what's kind of interesting about their wedding, let's see. First of all, Libra's rising. And Libra's rising with Jupiter and Saturn right there, conjunct. Which, I don't know, I mean, obviously any royal wedding is going to be watched a lot, but this does seem to be a very curious conjunction on the ascendant for the time of this wedding. But I think the rulers really spell out what kind of happens with this relationship, because Venus rules the first, and Venus is in Virgo, its worst sign, Virgo. It's also in the 12th, which is cadent and can't see the ascendant. So automatically we know that, yikes, this Venus has problems. And Venus is the planet of unions and romance, and this is the planet that's ruling this endeavor of this wedding, and it's in rough shape. And then the descendant is ruled by Mars, which is contrary to sect, and it's also in its worst sign, in Cancer. So, and then Venus is at 5 degrees Virgo, and its next aspect is an applying sextile directly to Mars in Cancer. So, in some ways, it's great, because the ruler of the first is forming an exact aspect with the ruler of the seventh. But the problem is that both planets are in their worst signs, and the planet that rules the whole enterprise is in the 12th, the house of undoing and catastrophe and all this other bad stuff. So I think this is kind of an interesting example of the fact that, just because you have an application between the two rulers doesn't necessarily mean it's going to turn out well. And as we know, it ultimately did end in divorce, and it was fairly, acrimonious and fraught and scandalous, and not a happy ending. The moon's next aspect, let's see, would have been, I guess, technically would have formed a square with Pluto, but visibly, it would have been conjoining Mercury next, which rules the Venus, but otherwise kind of unremarkable, aside from the fact that it's in Cancer, which is good, and at least it's separating from Mars. But it doesn't seem to be enough to overcome the degree to which the rulers of the first and seventh are contrary to sect, one of them being cadent, and then both of them being in their worst signs, the fallen signs. So then we have the more recent royal wedding. So let's take a look at this one. So this was on April 29th, 2011. 6 years ago was recent. God. Okay, so that was at 11:20, also in London. And here the ascendant is in Leo, so the sun rules Leo, and the sun is in the 10th house in Taurus. So we know this is a Sun-Saturn relationship, rather than a Venus-Mars one like his dad's was. And the sun is very prominently placed in the 10th house. And Saturn is in Libra, right at the bottom of the chart, this is very curiously placed. It rules the 7th, and it's on the IC in the 3rd, because in whole sign houses sometimes the IC can be in the 3rd or 5th. It's not always going to be in the 4th. And it's retrograde. So I'm not sure exactly what to make of this. I don't know a whole lot about their relationship, but what I do think is interesting is the fact that the rulers of the 1st and 7th are the Sun and Saturn, and both of them are ruled by Venus. And Venus in this chart, a lot like the chart of Queen Victoria's wedding, is pivotal, except this time it's on the MC rather than the descendant. It's on the midheaven. And that Venus is directly applying in an opposition to Saturn, the ruler of the 7th. So there's something that's very difficult or something about the relationship, which is overcome by this great positivity, this great blessing. I don't know. It's something that sort of they have to overcome. I'm not sure what that exactly is, but I think the fact that Venus rules both the ruler of the 1st and 7th, and that it has such a prominent place in the chart, and that it seems to be specifically ameliorating some of the more sad connotations of Saturn, is it's beautiful. The moon doesn't make a lot of sense. I would definitely not have elected this chart with this kind of moon. I mean, again, the moon is exactly square the bendings, just like in Queen Elizabeth II's wedding. And yeah, they seem to be all about that. I mean, maybe when you don't time your wedding, maybe that's like something you'd expect to see, especially since it's such a public event. The moon is like the people, and the people are, you know, wrapped with attention, watching this event unfold, either on the streets or on television, all across the world. So I don't know, maybe that has something to do with it, but I'm not sure. Its next application is to Uranus, technically, but and then after that to Pluto. But if we're going by visible applications, then it's technically applying right to Venus, which would be really nice. But I don't know. I think the fact that it hits these other invisible planets first sort of has to be considered before hitting the visible planets. So that's the marriage of Prince William and Kate Middleton. So now I'm going to take you to the only other example I have of one where I can tell you how it personally came out. So this is me, and this is my wife Beth, and yes, this is us kissing, and this is the moment we sealed the deal. And this is the chart that I elected, that I had the privilege of electing. Beth was my wife was very gracious to me to allow me the full reign of choosing when exactly we would have our wedding, since we were hosting in our backyard. So we had full control over when everything was going to happen. So I was supposed to have proposed to her on Valentine's Day of 2013, but that's a story for another time. So I ended up proposing to her like a couple days after. And so we knew since February, and we wanted to do it right away. But it either had to be before the summer because it would be too hot outside, or it's going to be after the summer. So I had those were my constraints. And obviously we wanted something on a weekend, so I had to consider that. And I finally fell on this date, and I think you'll see why if you look at a few of the things I've already talked about. So I made sure that the kiss, the actual moment that we sealed the deal, would happen at 7:07 p.m. So the reason I chose this time is because Sagittarius is rising. Jupiter is ruled by Sagittarius. Sorry. Jupiter rules Sagittarius. And Jupiter in this chart is located in the 7th house of partnerships. So the rule of the first is in the 7th. Then, the 7th house is Gemini, and it's ruled by Mercury. And Mercury is in its own sign of Gemini. And Mercury is forming a direct conjunction to Jupiter. So the ruler of the first, or rather the ruler of the 7th, is directly applying to the ruler of the first. Then we have the moon. The moon is in Sagittarius, and this is applying a direct opposition to Venus, which is also in the 7th of partnerships. So the moon is making a favorable application to Venus in the house of partnerships. And then not only that, but then the topic of relationships itself, represented by Mercury, is technically fulfilling a condition known as being bona fide, since its last aspect was a conjunction to a benefic, and its next aspect is a conjunction to a benefic. So it's sandwiched in between a benefic separation and a benefic application. So it's like really protected by the benefics. And in this case, very literally, with Venus and Jupiter on either side of Mercury. So I liked that. And then since I made sure that the sun was still above the horizon officially, and so this is actually the actual moment of this chart, is what this picture is of. So the sun was still out, so it was still daytime, which meant that Jupiter was the benefic of the sect. And Jupiter's ruling the first, that kind of adds to its benefic character. Then I had to treat the malefics carefully. I figured this would be better because with Mars being the contrary to sect malefic in a day chart, it would do better being underneath the horizon. And it's cadent, so it can't act too much. It can't do much damage. So it's stuck in the 6th. And the 6th is technically considered the joy of Mars. So I figured, oh well, okay, there he goes. That's the only place he can really be anyway. And then with Saturn, Saturn is diurnal, so it's okay if Saturn is above the horizon in this chart. And it's cadent, so he's deflected away. He doesn't have a huge role in the chart. And that's also technically his joy, is the 12th house. So I guess the only thing I can say for that is some people would say, well, I think it's pretty bad to put the malefics in bad houses. But I guess it just means that bad things will correlate with like difficult areas of life. You know, I think it would be better to have Mars and Saturn in houses where you already kind of expect bad things than to have bad things happen in places where you'd expect good things to happen. You know, if you have Mars and Saturn in the 7th house at the time of a marriage, then there would be problems in something that's supposed to be nice. It's supposed to be good. So that is why I chose this time. Now, my one reservation about this time was the fact that my Saturn is at 17 Sagittarius. The moon was right on my Saturn. So I wasn't sure exactly what to make of that, but I figured it was probably just a part of, you know, me coming up to my Saturn return and things like that. And I should note that while I love my wife very deeply, I would be lying if I said that, you know, it's been completely easy. And I think you can probably guess by looking at this chart what I may be talking about. With Saturn in Sagittarius, with Saturn in Scorpio, that meant that just a couple years after our marriage, that Saturn would be entering Sagittarius. So Saturn moving through Sagittarius, anyone could guess that would be kind of a tricky time because it's conjoining the ascendant, opposing the sun, conjoining the moon, opposing Venus, opposing Mercury, opposing Jupiter. And so our third child was born around the ingress of Saturn into Sagittarius. So the stress of a third child, our third and final child, has there's no other way to put it. It's just very, very, very difficult. And, you have to really remember to nurture your relationship. You can't take it for granted. And I think that let me just say, I'm going to be looking forward to Saturn being out of Sagittarius, at least for my marriage chart. Move on. It won't really be doing much to my chart then, or this chart. But yeah, it's it's been very draining. Hopefully, all these tough experiences we've gone through will make everything stronger. I mean, I feel like that's what Saturn does, and Saturn is of the sect in this chart, so that would indicate, it's not going to be it's not a deal breaker, So that is all I have to offer on ideal marriage elections. If you have any other examples of marriage elections that you've done or that you found for a celebrity or something, and you think it seems to match up with what we know about those couples, definitely let me know. If you like this video, please comment, please like, please share on your social networks, please subscribe to me on this channel, and thank you if you have been supporting me on Patreon. It definitely helps, and it helps me be able to keep on track with coming out with videos. And if you don't support me yet on Patreon, please check it out. I should have a button here on the screen, which will lead you to where you can find out of all the cool stuff you can get if you become a supporter of mine on Patreon. One of the coolest things, I think, is just the ability to get access to videos and articles I put out before everyone else, one day before everyone else. And you can get that with just $1 per video. So thank you very much for listening, and I will see you soon.